Welcome to Mystery Stories, a quiet place where small villages hide deep secrets and sharp minds quietly uncover the truth. Tonight's mystery begins in the peaceful lanes of St. Mary Mead, where a nervous guest arrives carrying a past he cannot escape. Miss Marple soon notices the fear behind his polite smile, and in a village where everyone observes everything, even the smallest clue can reveal the shadow of truth. Chapter 1. People in St. Mary Mead often said that the village was the sort of place where nothing truly surprising ever happened. Yet on that particular evening, just as the last of the sunlight faded behind the hedgerows and the smell of damp earth drifted softly through the air, several villagers found themselves speaking in quiet tones about a stranger who had arrived at the Rose and Crown guest house. It was not that strangers never visited the village. Travelers passed through from time to time, and the guest house was known for its comfortable rooms and Mrs. Dalton's excellent cooking. But something about this particular gentleman had unsettled people in a way that was difficult to explain. Miss Marple happened to be present when the gentleman first appeared in the dining room that evening. She had come to see Mrs. Dalton for a friendly visit and had accepted the invitation to stay for supper. Miss Marple always enjoyed the warm and cheerful atmosphere of the Rose and Crown. The low wooden beams, the gentle clink of china cups, and the soft murmur of conversation created a peaceful setting that suited her perfectly. The stranger entered quietly, carrying himself with the careful politeness of someone accustomed to proper manners. He was a thin man in his early 40s, with neat dark hair and a pale expression that suggested a certain weariness. Mrs. Dalton introduced him briefly as Mr. Adrian Faulkner, a gentleman who would be staying for a few days while attending to personal matters. At first glance, there seemed nothing remarkable about him. He thanked Mrs. Dalton politely, nodded to the other guests, and sat down at the table. Yet within a few minutes, Miss Marple had noticed something that the others had not. Mr. Faulkner chose his seat with unusual care. Instead of taking the comfortable chair nearest the fire, he selected one that allowed him to face both the door and the windows. He settled there slowly, as though making certain he could observe the entire room. Miss Marple watched this small action with quiet interest while she poured herself another cup of tea. As supper continued, several more curious details presented themselves. Each time the front door of the guest house opened, Mr. Faulkner's head turned sharply toward it. When footsteps passed along the hallway, his shoulders stiffened for just a moment before he forced himself to relax again. The movement was very subtle. Most people would not have noticed it at all. But Miss Marple noticed everything. She also noticed the gentleman's hands. When Mrs. Dalton served the tea, Mr. Faulkner lifted his cup carefully, but there was the faintest tremor in his fingers. The tremble lasted only a second before he steadied the cup against the saucer. A nervous traveler, perhaps, someone might have said. Yet Miss Marple had spent many years observing human nature, and she knew that ordinary nerves rarely caused a man to watch a doorway so carefully. Across the table, Mrs. Finch was already beginning to whisper quietly to Mrs. Pritchard. Mrs. Finch was a pleasant woman with an endless curiosity about the affairs of others, and she had a remarkable ability to notice details that many people overlooked. "He seems rather jumpy, don't you think?" she murmured softly. Mrs. Pritchard gave a thoughtful nod. "Traveling alone, perhaps," she replied. "Some people never grow used to it." Miss Marple smiled faintly into her teacup. She did not join the conversation, but she listened with interest. Meanwhile, Mr. Faulkner continued eating his supper with careful politeness. He spoke little, though when Mrs. Dalton asked if he had enjoyed the journey to the village, he answered kindly enough. His voice was quiet and well-spoken, yet there was a tension beneath the calm tone. When someone mentioned the peaceful nature of St. Mary Mead, Mr. Faulkner gave a small smile that seemed almost uncertain. "Yes," he said slowly, "it does seem very quiet here." Miss Marple noticed the way he said the word quiet. Not with relief, as most visitors did, but almost as though he doubted it. The conversation moved on to other topics, and eventually the meal ended. The guests began drifting into the sitting room, where a small fire burned pleasantly in the hearth. Miss Marple remained seated beside Mrs. Dalton for a moment while the others left the table. Mrs. Dalton leaned closer with the comfortable familiarity of an old friend. "That gentleman arrived this afternoon," she said quietly. "Very polite, but rather nervous, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes," she said, stirring her tea slowly. "I noticed he prefers to keep the room in view." Mrs. Dalton looked slightly surprised. "Well, now that you mention it, yes." She hesitated for a moment, then added another detail in a lower voice. "He asked me something rather odd when he checked in." Miss Marple raised her eyes with mild interest. "Oh?" Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice even further. "He wanted to know if the village church keeps very old records. Baptisms and burials and such things." Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. "That is an unusual question for a traveler," she said. Mrs. Dalton nodded. "That is what I thought too. Especially since he seemed quite anxious to know how far back the records go." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "Well," she said calmly, "St. Mary Mead does have a very long memory." The evening passed quietly after that. The guests returned to their rooms one by one, and soon the guest house grew still. Yet the following morning brought a small piece of gossip that added another layer to the mystery. Miss Marple had just arrived for breakfast when the young maid, Lily, approached Mrs. Dalton with a puzzled expression. "Mrs. Dalton," she said softly, "I don't think the gentleman in room 3 slept very much last night." Mrs. Dalton looked up with concern. "Did he complain about anything?" Lily shook her head. "No, ma'am, but I heard his door opening several times. When I went past the hallway with the laundry, he was standing there, looking down the corridor." Miss Marple listened quietly from the breakfast table. Mrs. Dalton frowned slightly. Perhaps he was restless. Lily hesitated before answering. "Well, ma'am, it looked more like he was expecting someone." Miss Marple glanced down at her teacup. A person who expected visitors during the night usually had a reason. When Mr. Faulkner finally appeared for breakfast, his appearance confirmed Lily's observation. His face looked pale and tired, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes. He greeted everyone politely, yet his attention wandered constantly toward the windows. At one point, the postman walked past outside, and Mr. Faulkner turned so quickly that his chair scraped softly against the floor. He quickly apologized, but the moment had already revealed something important. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, often shows itself in small movements long before anyone speaks of it. Mrs. Finch, who never allowed a curious situation to pass unnoticed, leaned closer across the table. "Did you sleep poorly, Mr. Faulkner?" she asked kindly. The gentleman forced a small smile. "Not particularly well," he admitted. "New places can feel strange at first," Mrs. Finch said sympathetically. "Yes," Mr. Faulkner replied slowly. "Strange." The word lingered in the air for a moment. Miss Marple studied the man thoughtfully while buttering her toast. It was not simply that he had slept poorly. Many travelers did. But a man who opened his door repeatedly in the night was usually listening for something. Or someone. Later that morning, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village lane, as she often did, while thinking over the small events of daily life. The hedges rustled softly in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell sounded the hour. St. Mary Mead looked exactly as peaceful as it always had. Yet Miss Marple's mind returned again and again to the anxious face of Mr. Adrian Faulkner. Fear, she reflected quietly, was a very curious thing. Some people feared imaginary dangers. Others feared something they had already seen. And sometimes, though it was not pleasant to consider, a person might fear something from their own past. By the time Miss Marple returned to the guest house that afternoon, she noticed another small detail. Mr. Faulkner was standing near the front window. He was not admiring the view. He was watching the road. And when a passing cart rolled slowly along the lane, the gentleman stepped back from the window as though he did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple paused briefly beside the garden gate and observed this movement with quiet attention. Then she continued toward the door with her usual calm smile. It was always interesting, she thought gently, when a visitor arrived in St. Mary Mead carrying more worry than luggage. Because the peaceful village had a curious habit of revealing the truth behind such worries. And as Miss Marple stirred her tea once more that afternoon, she began to wonder what sort of past could make a grown man afraid, even in the safest village in England. Chapter 2. There was a small piece of gossip circulating through St. Mary Mead the following afternoon, and like most village gossip, it began in the most ordinary way imaginable. Mrs. Finch had mentioned at the baker's shop that the new gentleman staying at the Rose and Crown had looked extremely uncomfortable during breakfast, and by the time the story had passed through 2 more conversations, it had become generally accepted that the man was either hiding from someone or expecting trouble. In a village like St. Mary Mead, such a suggestion was enough to stir a mild excitement beneath the calm routines of daily life. Miss Marple first heard the remark while visiting the vicarage garden later that day. The vicar's wife had arranged a small afternoon tea, one of those pleasant gatherings where neighbors came together to exchange polite conversation and enjoy the sunshine. It was a peaceful setting, with neatly trimmed roses climbing the garden wall and the faint scent of lavender drifting through the warm air. Miss Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the edge of the lawn, her teacup resting lightly in her hand. From this position, she could observe nearly everyone present without appearing to do so. It was a skill she had developed over many years. People tended to behave quite naturally when they believed no one was paying particular attention. Mrs. Dalton arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by Mr. Adrian Faulkner, who seemed slightly reluctant to attend, but had accepted the invitation out of politeness. His expression held the same cautious tension Miss Marple had noticed the evening before. As they approached the garden table, Mrs. Finch leaned closer to Mrs. Pritchard and spoke in a low voice that was meant to be discreet, but carried easily through the quiet afternoon air. "That must be him," she murmured. Mrs. Pritchard glanced over with interest. "He does look rather worried," she replied. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly and watched Mr. Faulkner greet the other guests. He was perfectly courteous, thanking the vicar's wife for the invitation and complimenting the garden with careful politeness. Yet there was a curious alertness about him. His eyes moved constantly from face to face, as though measuring the intentions of everyone present. When he finally sat down at the table, Miss Marple noticed that he had chosen a chair with his back to the hedge rather than the open lawn. It was the sort of small decision that most people made without thinking. But Mr. Faulkner had clearly thought about it. The conversation soon settled into the comfortable rhythm of village gossip. Mrs. Finch discussed the difficulty of finding good servants, the vicar spoke about the repairs needed on the church roof, and Colonel Harbury began telling a long story about the peculiar habits of retired officers. Mr. Faulkner listened politely, though he spoke very little. Miss Marple watched him quietly over the rim of her teacup. At one point, the colonel mentioned an old dispute that had once involved several local families. The matter had been settled years ago, though it had caused considerable excitement at the time. "A dreadful inheritance quarrel," the colonel said with a faint shake of his head. "Nearly split the entire parish in 2. Miss Marple noticed something very interesting. Mr. Faulkner's hand froze slightly as he lifted his teacup. The movement lasted no more than a second, yet it was unmistakable. Miss Marple observed the reaction with mild curiosity. It was always fascinating, she thought, how certain subjects could produce such sudden tension in a person. The colonel continued speaking, unaware of the effect his words had produced. "Of course, it all happened long before most people here arrived," he added. "Still, the Hawthorne matter was quite the talk of the county in its day." At the mention of the name Hawthorne, Mr. Faulkner placed his teacup carefully back on the saucer. Miss Marple noticed the way he looked down at the tablecloth rather than at the speaker. It was the sort of gesture a person might make when trying very hard not to appear interested. Mrs. Finch leaned forward eagerly. "I remember hearing about that," she said. "Something to do with a will, wasn't it?" "Yes, indeed," the colonel replied. "A complicated business involving distant relatives and a great deal of unpleasant suspicion." Miss Marple glanced briefly toward Mr. Faulkner. His expression remained calm, yet there was a tightness around his mouth that had not been there before. The conversation drifted away from the subject soon afterward, but Miss Marple had already filed the reaction away in her mind. Later, when the guests moved into smaller groups around the garden, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly beside Mr. Faulkner near the rose bushes. She spoke gently, with the warm friendliness that made people feel comfortable speaking with her. St. Mary Mead can seem very peaceful to visitors, she said. Though of course every village has its little histories, Mr. Faulkner gave a polite nod. Yes, I imagine so. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. Our church records are quite fascinating as well. Some of them go back many generations. For just a moment, Mr. Faulkner's eyes flickered toward her. It was a quick glance, but it held a sudden, sharp interest. Oh, he said carefully. Miss Marple nodded. Baptisms, marriages, burials, all the quiet events that shape a village over time. Mr. Faulkner hesitated before answering. That must make the place feel very permanent. Indeed, Miss Marple replied softly. He seemed about to say something further, but at that moment, Mrs. Dalton called him back toward the tea table. Miss Marple watched him walk away. There had been something curious in that brief exchange. It was not merely that Mr. Faulkner had asked about church records. It was the way he had reacted when she mentioned them. Later that afternoon, another small remark reached Miss Marple through the gentle flow of village conversation. Mrs. Finch approached her while adjusting her hat. "My dear Miss Marple," she said in a confidential tone, "I noticed something rather odd earlier today." Miss Marple gave her a kindly smile. "Did you?" "Yes, indeed. That gentleman from the guest house was standing inside the church this morning." Miss Marple listened with interest. Mrs. Finch lowered her voice slightly. "He was studying the memorial plaques on the wall. Not just glancing at them, you understand. He was reading every single name." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "People sometimes feel drawn to such things," she said. Mrs. Finch leaned closer. "Yes, but when I asked if he had relatives in the parish, he looked quite startled." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Startled reactions, she knew, often revealed more than words. The tea gathering ended peacefully soon afterward, and the guests began drifting back toward their homes. Miss Marple returned slowly along the village lane, enjoying the quiet afternoon air. Yet as she walked, she found herself thinking again about Mr. Adrian Faulkner. His nervous glances, his careful seating choices, his sudden reaction to the name Hawthorne, and his unusual interest in the church records. Each detail alone meant very little, but taken together they suggested something rather different. Someone who studied church memorials was usually searching for a name, and people who searched for names often had a reason. That evening brought another curious development. The maid at the Rose and Crown mentioned something unusual while speaking with Mrs. Dalton in the kitchen. Miss Marple happened to be present when the girl described what she had seen. "Late last night," Lily said quietly, "I heard footsteps outside Mr. Faulkner's room again." Mrs. Dalton frowned. "Was he awake?" "Yes, ma'am, and what was he doing?" Lily hesitated before answering. "He opened the door and looked down the hallway again. Just like before." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Did he say anything?" "No, ma'am, but he looked as if he expected someone to be there." Mrs. Dalton shook her head. "That is very strange behavior." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes," she said. "Very strange indeed." The following morning added yet another small piece to the puzzle. A letter arrived for Mr. Faulkner. Miss Marple noticed him reading it near the fireplace in the sitting room. His face grew pale as he studied the contents. Then, without a word, he folded the paper carefully and placed it into the fire. Miss Marple watched the corner of the letter curl slowly in the flames. Burning a letter was a very deliberate action. Most people saved their correspondence, even unpleasant ones. But a man who destroyed a letter immediately had usually read something he wished no one else to see. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple stood near the guest house window and looked out toward the quiet road. The hedges moved gently in the breeze, and the village seemed as calm as ever. Yet inside the guest house, a frightened man was burning letters and watching doorways. Miss Marple folded her hands thoughtfully. Fear, she reflected, was rarely without cause, and when a man carried such deep unease into a quiet village like St. Mary Mead, it usually meant that something or someone had followed him there. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, because somewhere in the gentle routines of the village, she suspected the first shadow of that mystery had already appeared. Chapter 3. In a village like St. Mary Mead, new arrivals were never truly unnoticed. Even the quiet appearance of a passing traveler could stir gentle speculation among the villagers. And when two strangers appeared within a matter of days, curiosity naturally deepened into something a little more attentive. The matter first reached Miss Marple's ears through a remark spoken rather casually at the post office. Though the tone suggested that the speaker suspected a great deal more than she was saying aloud. Miss Marple had stopped by that morning to collect a small parcel, when Mrs. Finch appeared behind her with the pleased expression of someone carrying interesting news. "My dear Miss Marple," she said quietly while adjusting the ribbon on her hat, "I believe we have another visitor in the village." Miss Marple turned with a mild look of interest. "Indeed?" "Yes. A tall gentleman. Very well dressed. I saw him speaking with Mr. Harris outside the grocer's shop just now." Miss Marple listened politely. "Passing through, perhaps?" Mrs. Finch shook her head thoughtfully. "Well, that is what he said, of course. But I noticed something rather curious." Miss Marple waited patiently. "He asked Mr. Harris if there were any good guest houses nearby, and when Mr. Harris mentioned the Rose and Crown, the gentleman seemed very interested." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. "That does sound convenient for a traveler." "Yes," Mrs. Finch replied slowly, though the way he asked about it suggested he had been hoping to hear that very answer. Miss Marple thanked her kindly, and left the shop soon afterward, though the remark remained quietly in her thoughts. It was late morning when the second stranger finally appeared at the Rose and Crown. Miss Marple happened to be sitting near the front window with her teacup when the man arrived. He stepped through the door with the easy confidence of someone entirely comfortable in unfamiliar places. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and neatly dressed, with carefully brushed hair and a polite but distant expression. His manner was pleasant enough, though there was something about his eyes that suggested he was constantly measuring the room around him. Mrs. Dalton greeted him warmly. "Good morning, sir. How may I help you?" The gentleman removed his hat and offered a courteous smile. "My name is Leonard Cresswell," he said. "I'm traveling through the area and hoped you might have a room available for a night or two." Mrs. Dalton nodded at once. "Of course, we have a comfortable room upstairs." Miss Marple watched the exchange quietly from her table. Mr. Cresswell's manner was smooth and confident, yet she noticed a small detail that most people would have missed. Before answering Mrs. Dalton, the man's eyes moved slowly around the room. Not casually, carefully. He seemed to be checking who was present. At that very moment, Mr. Adrian Faulkner stepped out from the hallway carrying a book he had borrowed from the sitting room shelf. The two men saw each other at the same instant. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Mr. Faulkner stopped completely still. His face turned pale, and the book slipped slightly in his hand before he caught it again. Mr. Cresswell's reaction was very different. He smiled. It was a polite smile, yet it contained no warmth whatsoever. "Mr. Faulkner," he said calmly. The name seemed to fall heavily into the quiet room. Miss Marple noticed the tension at once. Mr. Faulkner attempted a polite nod. "Mr. Cresswell," he replied. There was a short silence before Mrs. Dalton, unaware of the significance of the moment, spoke again cheerfully. "Oh, you two already know each other?" Mr. Cresswell answered smoothly. "Only slightly. A business acquaintance from some years ago." Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Faulkner did not respond to that remark. He simply lowered his eyes and walked quietly toward the back hallway. His steps were steady, yet there was a stiffness in his posture that had not been there before. Mr. Cresswell watched him go. The polite smile remained on his face, though his eyes had grown noticeably sharper. Miss Marple lifted her teacup thoughtfully. Encounters between acquaintances rarely produce such visible discomfort. Later that afternoon, the village post office became the center of another small observation. Miss Marple had stopped by again to send a letter when she noticed Mr. Faulkner standing near the doorway. He seemed restless, shifting his weight slightly while glancing out toward the road. A few moments later, Mr. Cresswell entered the shop. The change in Mr. Faulkner was immediate. He stiffened slightly and turned away as though examining the display of postcards. Mr. Cresswell approached the counter with easy confidence. "Good afternoon," he said pleasantly. The shopkeeper greeted him politely, and the two exchanged a few ordinary remarks about the village and the weather. Then Mr. Cresswell asked a question that caught Miss Marple's attention at once. "Would you happen to know where I might find information about the Hawthorne estate?" The shopkeeper frowned thoughtfully. "The old Hawthorne house out near the fields?" "Yes," Mr. Cresswell replied. "Well," the shopkeeper said, "it hasn't been occupied much in recent years. Complicated inheritance business, I believe." Miss Marple noticed something very interesting. Mr. Faulkner's hand tightened slightly around the postcards he was holding. The movement lasted only a second, but it revealed a great deal. Mr. Cresswell thanked the shopkeeper and turned toward the door. As he passed Mr. Faulkner, he spoke quietly enough that only those nearby could hear. "Still interested in old matters, Faulkner?" Mr. Faulkner did not answer. He simply left the shop a moment later. Miss Marple remained standing near the counter for a few seconds longer. Then she stepped outside. The afternoon air felt warm and peaceful, yet the scene she had just witnessed suggested that something less comfortable had entered the quiet life of St. Mary Mead. Mr. Faulkner was walking quickly along the lane toward the guest house. He did not look back. Miss Marple returned slowly to the Rose and Crown later that day. Inside, she found Mrs. Dalton arranging fresh flowers near the window. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Dalton said cheerfully, "have you met our new guest yet?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "Mr. Cresswell, I believe." "That is right. Very pleasant gentleman." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed," Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice slightly, "though I must say there was something rather awkward when he arrived earlier." Miss Marple waited patiently. "Well, when he saw Mr. Faulkner, the two of them looked terribly uncomfortable." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, I noticed." Mrs. Dalton hesitated before continuing. "Do you suppose they have quarreled about something?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Old acquaintances sometimes carry old disagreements," she said calmly. That evening brought yet another curious detail. Miss Marple happened to pass through the sitting room just as Mr. Faulkner entered from outside. His face looked more troubled than ever. He paused near the fireplace and removed a letter from his coat pocket. Miss Marple could not see the contents, but she noticed the way his expression changed as he read. The color drained from his face. His hand trembled slightly. Then, after a long moment, he folded the letter and placed it carefully into the fire. The paper curled slowly as the flames consumed it. Miss Marple watched the small corner of the page blacken and disappear. Burning a letter suggested urgency, but it also suggested fear. Mr. Faulkner stood there for several seconds, watching the flames as though trying to make certain every word had vanished. Then he left the room quietly. Miss Marple sat down beside the fire after he had gone. A single fragment of the letter had escaped the flames. It was only a small piece of paper, no larger than a postage stamp. Yet 3 words remained visible. Old Hawthorne Truth. Miss Marple studied the fragment thoughtfully before allowing it to fall into the fire as well. The quiet sitting room seemed perfectly ordinary once more. But Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair and considered everything she had observed over the past 2 days. A frightened man who watched every doorway, a confident visitor who followed him to the village, and an old estate whose history seemed to trouble them both. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. The past, she reflected, had a curious habit of returning when least expected. And somewhere within that quiet village, beneath polite smiles and careful conversations, the truth behind the Hawthorne estate was beginning to stir. Chapter 4. It was a curious thing about quiet villages that the most interesting discoveries often happened during the calmest mornings. On that particular day, the sun rose gently over the fields around St. Mary Mead, and the village looked exactly as it always did. Smoke curled softly from cottage chimneys, the hedges glittered faintly with dew, and the church bell rang its steady, familiar chime. To any casual observer, the place appeared entirely peaceful. Yet Miss Marple, walking slowly along the narrow path toward the churchyard, carried in her mind several small observations that refused to settle comfortably together. The matter of Mr. Adrian Faulkner and the arrival of Mr. Leonard Cresswell had already begun to form a pattern that Miss Marple found difficult to ignore. Two men who clearly knew one another, one openly confident, the other visibly afraid, and both showing a most unusual interest in the old Hawthorne estate. Miss Marple believed strongly that when people showed such interest in the past usually contained something worth examining. The church of St. Mary Mead stood quietly among ancient yew trees, its gray stone walls warmed by the morning light. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and old books. Miss Marple entered with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had visited the place countless times before. Near the back of the church stood a small wooden cabinet where the parish records were kept. The vicar trusted Miss Marple completely and had long ago allowed her to examine the old registers whenever she wished. They contained the slow history of the village itself, written carefully across many generations. Miss Marple opened the cabinet and removed one of the heavier volumes. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting inside varied depending on which clergymen had recorded the entries. Names appeared in neat rows, marking births, marriages, and quiet departures from the world. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly. She was not searching randomly. She was searching for Hawthorne. It did not take long to find the entries she wanted. Margaret Hawthorne had been buried nearly 15 years earlier. The entry described her as the widow of a well-respected landowner who had lived for many years in the large house beyond the western fields. The Hawthorne estate had once been one of the most comfortable properties in the district. Miss Marple studied the entry carefully. Margaret Hawthorne had died rather suddenly. There was nothing particularly unusual about that in itself. People often passed away quietly in their later years. Yet Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that sudden deaths sometimes created unexpected consequences. She continued turning the pages. Soon she found the note concerning the estate that followed Margaret Hawthorne's passing. The house and property had transferred to a distant relative named Adrian Faulkner. Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. The name confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. Mr. Adrian Faulkner had not chosen St. Mary Mead at random. He had once owned property here. Miss Marple closed the book gently and returned it to the cabinet. The church remained quiet around her, though she noticed footsteps approaching from outside. A moment later, the vicar entered, carrying a small stack of letters. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said pleasantly. "Good morning," she replied with a warm smile. The vicar set the letters down and looked toward the cabinet. "Researching something interesting?" Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. "I was just refreshing my memory about the Hawthorne estate." The vicar's expression changed slightly. "Ah, yes, that business caused quite a stir in its day." Miss Marple tilted her head gently. "Indeed? Yes. There was a great deal of confusion over the inheritance at the time." Miss Marple listened carefully. The vicar continued in a reflective tone. "There were actually two possible heirs, you see. Mr. Faulkner eventually inherited the property, though another gentleman had made a claim as well." Miss Marple did not speak immediately. Instead, she waited quietly, knowing that silence often encouraged people to continue. After a moment, the vicar added the final detail. The other gentleman's name was Leonard Cresswell. Miss Marple felt a small sense of satisfaction at hearing the name confirmed. That must have been quite a complicated situation, she said gently. The vicar nodded. Yes, though the matter was settled eventually. The claim was withdrawn, and the estate passed to Mr. Faulkner without further difficulty. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. Inheritance disputes rarely ended without difficulty. Yet she did not say so aloud. Instead, she thanked the vicar and left the churchyard, walking slowly back toward the village road. As she passed the hedgerow, she noticed two villagers standing nearby, discussing the subject that seemed to be quietly spreading through St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Pritchard were speaking in their usual low voices. "I saw that tall gentleman again this morning," Mrs. Finch said. "The one who arrived yesterday." Mrs. Pritchard nodded. "Yes, Mr. Cresswell. He was speaking with Mr. Harding, the solicitor." Miss Marple slowed her pace slightly as she walked past. Mrs. Finch continued. "They were talking about the Hawthorne estate. I heard the name quite clearly." Mrs. Pritchard frowned thoughtfully. "That is odd. I thought the matter had been settled years ago." Miss Marple continued along the lane without interrupting the conversation. Yet the remark had confirmed something important. Mr. Cresswell was not simply passing through the village. He was reopening old questions. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Rose and Crown once more. Mrs. Dalton greeted her warmly as usual. "My dear Miss Marple, you look thoughtful today." Miss Marple smiled. "I was just enjoying the morning air." Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice slightly. "There is something rather worrying about Mr. Faulkner." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows mildly. "Oh, yes, he seems more anxious than ever." Miss Marple glanced toward the staircase. "Has something happened?" Mrs. Dalton hesitated. "Well, I noticed him pacing the hallway earlier, and he asked me a very strange question." "What sort of question?" "He wanted to know whether anyone had asked about him." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "And had they?" "No, of course not." Mrs. Dalton looked puzzled. "Still, he seemed very relieved to hear it." Miss Marple nodded gently. Fear, she reflected, often made people expect danger even when none had appeared yet. Just then the front door opened and Mr. Faulkner stepped inside. His appearance confirmed Mrs. Dalton's concern. His face looked pale and drawn, and he moved with the restless energy of someone unable to relax even for a moment. When he noticed Miss Marple, he attempted a polite smile. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," Miss Marple replied kindly. He hesitated for a moment as though considering whether to say something further. Instead, he simply nodded and walked upstairs. Miss Marple watched him disappear along the corridor. Mrs. Dalton shook her head softly. "Poor man. He looks terribly troubled." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Yes," she said quietly. A short while later, another guest entered the sitting room. Mr. Leonard Cresswell. He carried himself with the same calm confidence Miss Marple had noticed before. When he saw her seated near the fireplace, he paused politely. "Miss Marple, I believe?" She smiled pleasantly. "That is correct." He inclined his head slightly. "I understand you are something of an expert on the history of the village." Miss Marple laughed gently. "Oh dear, I would not claim such a grand title." Mr. Cresswell smiled. "Still, I hoped you might know something about the Hawthorne estate." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "It has an interesting history." "Yes," he said slowly. "So I have heard." There was a brief pause before he added another remark. "I believe Mr. Faulkner once owned the property." Miss Marple nodded calmly. "That is correct." Mr. Cresswell's smile remained perfectly polite. Strange how such matters return after many years. Miss Marple studied his expression carefully. "Yes," she said softly. "The past can be very persistent." Mr. Cresswell gave a small laugh. "Quite true." Yet there was something in his tone that suggested he found the idea rather satisfying. After a moment, he excused himself and left the room. Miss Marple remained seated quietly beside the fire. Two men connected by the same inheritance. One frightened, one confident, and both suddenly present in the same small village where the matter had first taken place. Miss Marple rested her teacup gently on the table. When old disputes returned so suddenly, it often meant that something important had been left unfinished, and somewhere within the quiet history of the Hawthorne estate, Miss Marple suspected that a truth had been waiting patiently for many years to be discovered. Chapter 5. It was a widely accepted belief in St. Mary Mead that the quietest nights were often the most peaceful. The village usually settled into silence shortly after dusk. Lamps glowed warmly behind cottage windows, the lanes grew empty, and the only sounds that remained were the distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the hedges. Yet on that particular night at the Rose and Crown guest house, the stillness of the village was broken by a small disturbance that left more questions behind than answers. The matter began shortly after midnight. Mrs. Dalton was a light sleeper, and years of running a guest house had trained her ears to notice unusual sounds. She had been resting comfortably when a sudden sharp noise reached her from the upper hallway. It was not loud enough to cause alarm at once, but it carried the unmistakable sound of something being knocked over. She sat upright in bed and listened. For a moment, the house returned to silence. Then, she heard footsteps. Slow footsteps moving across the floor above. Mrs. Dalton slipped on her robe and stepped quietly into the hallway. The guest house was dimly lit, the small lamp near the staircase casting long shadows along the walls. The footsteps were coming from Mr. Faulkner's room. Mrs. Dalton climbed the stairs carefully and paused outside the door. "Mr. Faulkner?" She called gently. For a few seconds, there was no answer. Then, she heard movement inside the room, followed by the sound of the lock turning. The door opened slowly. Mr. Adrian Faulkner stood there in the dim light, his face pale and drawn. His hair looked slightly disordered, and his breathing seemed uneven, as though he had been startled awake. "Mrs. Dalton," he said quietly. "I'm terribly sorry to disturb you," she replied kindly. "I heard a noise and wanted to make sure everything was all right." Mr. Faulkner hesitated before answering. Yes, everything is quite fine." Yet his voice lacked the calm confidence of someone speaking the truth. Mrs. Dalton glanced past him into the room. A small chair near the window had fallen sideways, though nothing else appeared out of place. "Did something happen?" she asked gently. Mr. Faulkner looked toward the window. "I thought I heard someone outside." Mrs. Dalton frowned slightly. "Outside the window?" "Yes." His eyes remained fixed on the dark garden beyond the glass. Mrs. Dalton stepped closer and looked out. The garden lay silent under the pale moonlight. The hedges moved softly in the breeze, and the narrow path leading toward the lane appeared empty. "I don't see anyone," she said. Mr. Faulkner swallowed slowly. Yes, perhaps I imagined it. But the tension in his voice suggested he did not truly believe that explanation. Mrs. Dalton gave him a reassuring smile. "It is very quiet here at night. Sometimes the wind makes strange sounds." Mr. Faulkner nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Of course. She wished him good night and returned downstairs, though the uneasiness in his face lingered in her thoughts. The following morning, the story reached Miss Marple over breakfast. The dining room of the Rose and Crown held its usual calm atmosphere, with sunlight streaming gently through the windows and the soft clink of teacups echoing against the wooden walls. Miss Marple had just begun buttering her toast when Mrs. Dalton mentioned the disturbance. "Poor Mr. Faulkner had quite a fright last night," she said quietly. Miss Marple looked up with mild interest. "Did something occur?" Mrs. Dalton nodded. "He thought someone was outside his window." Miss Marple paused thoughtfully. "And was there?" "Well, I could not see anyone." Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. Still, it must have seemed very real to him. Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice. "He looked quite shaken, Miss Marple. Not the sort of reaction one expects from a simple misunderstanding." Miss Marple gave a gentle nod. Fear rarely appeared without reason. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked through the garden behind the guest house. The morning air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp grass. She paused near the side of the building and glanced upward toward the window of Mr. Faulkner's room. Then she looked down. The soil beneath the window was soft from the previous evening's rain. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. There, clearly visible in the damp earth, was a footprint. It was the mark of a man's shoe. Miss Marple studied it carefully. The footprint pointed toward the road rather than toward the house, which suggested something rather interesting. Whoever had stood there had not been approaching the window. He had been leaving. Miss Marple straightened slowly and looked toward the narrow lane beyond the hedges. The village road lay quiet and empty, yet the footprint suggested that someone had indeed been standing beneath Mr. Faulkner's window during the night. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the guest house sitting room where Mr. Faulkner sat alone near the fireplace. He looked even more tired than before. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Faulkner." He looked up quickly. "Oh, Miss Marple. Mrs. Dalton mentioned that you had a rather restless night." Mr. Faulkner forced a small smile. "Nothing serious, I assure you." Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite him. Sometimes unfamiliar places make sleep difficult. "Yes," he said quietly. There was a pause before Miss Marple added another remark. "I happened to notice the garden this morning." Mr. Faulkner's expression changed immediately. "The garden?" "Yes. The soil beneath your window is quite soft." Mr. Faulkner stared at her. Miss Marple continued gently. "There appears to be a footprint there." For a moment, Mr. Faulkner said nothing at all. His face had grown noticeably pale. "You saw it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes." He leaned back slowly in his chair. "I was afraid of that." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "You believe someone was there?" Mr. Faulkner hesitated. "I cannot be certain," but his tone suggested he was very certain indeed. After a moment, he spoke again in a low voice. "I think it would be best if I left the village soon." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Leaving quickly sometimes creates more attention than remaining quietly. Mr. Faulkner gave a tired smile. "You may be right." He looked toward the window for several seconds before speaking again. "There are certain matters from the past that have a way of following a person." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Instead, she waited patiently. But Mr. Faulkner seemed unwilling to say more. Later that evening, another small observation reached Miss Marple through the gentle flow of village gossip. Mrs. Finch had seen Mr. Leonard Cresswell walking along the lane near the Rose and Crown very late the previous night. "He said he was taking a walk," Mrs. Finch explained thoughtfully. Though it seemed a rather odd hour for exercise, Miss Marple listened carefully. "Did he say where he had been walking?" Mrs. Finch shook her head. "No, but he came from the direction of the guest house." Miss Marple thanked her kindly. That night, Miss Marple sat quietly beside the sitting room fire, while the guest house slowly settled into its usual calm silence. The events of the past few days moved carefully through her mind. A frightened man who expected danger. A second man who had followed him to the village. A footprint beneath a window. And a midnight visitor who had walked away toward the road. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair. Fear, she reflected gently, was sometimes the shadow of guilt. But at other times it was the shadow of something far more dangerous. And somewhere in the quiet darkness outside the Rose and Crown, Miss Marple suspected that someone had already taken the first step toward revealing the truth behind Mr. Adrian Faulkner's fear. Chapter 6. In St. Mary Mead, important conversations rarely began in dramatic ways. They usually started quietly, with a polite greeting, a cup of tea, and a few harmless remarks about the weather. Yet Miss Marple had long ago learned that some of the most revealing truths appeared during the most ordinary conversations. On that particular morning, she had already decided that a careful talk with Mr. Leonard Cresswell might prove rather interesting. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Miss Marple had just settled into her usual chair near the window of the Rose and Crown sitting room when Mr. Cresswell entered. He carried a newspaper beneath his arm and appeared entirely at ease, as though the quiet rhythms of the village suited him perfectly. He greeted Miss Marple with polite confidence. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning," she replied warmly. Mr. Cresswell took the chair opposite her and unfolded his newspaper with calm precision. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The room was peaceful, filled only with the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "I hear you have been exploring the village," she said. Mr. Cresswell smiled pleasantly. "It is a charming place." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "People sometimes underestimate how much history can be found in quiet villages." Mr. Cresswell folded the corner of his newspaper and looked at her thoughtfully. "That is quite true." Miss Marple allowed a small pause before continuing. "I understand you were speaking with Mr. Harding yesterday." Mr. Cresswell nodded without hesitation. "The solicitor, yes? About the Hawthorne estate, I believe." For the briefest moment, the pleasant expression on his face shifted slightly. The change was subtle, almost invisible, but Miss Marple noticed it at once. "Yes," he said slowly. "A very old matter." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Old matters have a curious habit of returning." Mr. Cresswell leaned back comfortably in his chair. "Inheritance questions often do." Miss Marple studied him with quiet attention, particularly when two people once believed the same property belonged to them. Mr. Cresswell laughed softly. "You have been speaking with the vicar, I suspect." Miss Marple returned the smile. "One hears many things in a village." Mr. Cresswell remained calm. "The claim was resolved years ago," he said smoothly. "Mr. Faulkner inherited the estate, and the matter ended there." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Yet you have reopened the discussion." Mr. Cresswell's smile returned. "One might say I have become curious about certain legal details." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Curiosity can be a powerful motivation. There was a brief silence before Mr. Cresswell added another remark. "I imagine Mr. Faulkner must find the subject rather uncomfortable." Miss Marple watched him closely. "Why do you think so?" Mr. Cresswell shrugged lightly. "Some people prefer the past to remain exactly where it is." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She had noticed something interesting in his tone. There was confidence in his voice, but beneath that confidence lay something sharper. A quiet satisfaction. The conversation ended politely soon afterward, yet Miss Marple remained thoughtful long after Mr. Cresswell had left the room. The man had spoken smoothly and confidently, but his explanations had contained several small inconsistencies. Most notably, he had shown very little surprise at learning that Mr. Faulkner was staying in the same guest house. Miss Marple suspected that was no coincidence. Later that afternoon, another piece of information arrived in the gentle form of village gossip. Mrs. Finch appeared at the guest house doorway with her usual air of mild excitement. "My dear Miss Marple," she said quietly, "you will never guess where I saw Mr. Cresswell this morning." Miss Marple smiled. "Where indeed?" "Walking with Mr. Harding near the solicitor's office." Miss Marple listened with interest. They seemed to be discussing papers of some sort. Legal documents, perhaps? Miss Marple nodded gently. "That would make sense." Mrs. Finch leaned closer. "And do you know what else I heard?" Miss Marple waited patiently. "Mr. Cresswell has asked the solicitor to review the Hawthorne inheritance again." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "I see." Mrs. Finch lowered her voice further. "It does seem a strange time to reopen such an old matter," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "Yes, very strange indeed." That evening, Miss Marple returned once more to the sitting room of the Rose and Crown. The fire burned softly in the hearth, and the room held its usual peaceful warmth. Mr. Faulkner was not present. Miss Marple noticed something unusual near the fireplace. A thin layer of gray ash remained in the grate from the previous night's fire. Miss Marple knelt slowly beside it. She was not searching for anything in particular. Yet sometimes the smallest fragments could reveal the most interesting details. As she brushed the ash lightly with a small poker, a piece of charred paper shifted into view. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. Most of the paper had been destroyed by the flames, yet one small corner remained. 3 words were still visible. Old Hawthorne Truth. Miss Marple examined the fragment thoughtfully. The handwriting appeared hurried, as though the letter had been written in some urgency. She considered the words carefully before allowing the fragment to fall gently back into the ashes. Someone had written that message to Mr. Faulkner, and he had been so anxious to destroy it that he had burned the letter immediately after reading it. That suggested the message had been important, and possibly dangerous. Later that evening, Mr. Faulkner returned to the sitting room. His face looked more strained than ever. He greeted Miss Marple politely, but seemed distracted. Miss Marple offered him a gentle smile. "You appear troubled, Mr. Faulkner." He hesitated before answering. "I am simply tired." Miss Marple nodded kindly. Poor sleep can make everything seem more worrying than it truly is. Mr. Faulkner sat down heavily in the chair opposite her. "There are times," he said quietly, "when the past refuses to remain quiet." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Yes," she replied softly. "That does happen." He looked toward the fire. "Some mistakes cannot be forgotten." Miss Marple spoke gently. "And some truths eventually return whether we welcome them or not." Mr. Faulkner did not reply, but his expression suggested that the remark had struck very close to something he already feared. After a moment, he rose from the chair. "I think I may retire early tonight." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Of course." He paused near the doorway before leaving the room. For just a moment, he looked back toward the fireplace, where the ashes still rested quietly in the grate. Then he left. Miss Marple remained seated beside the fire for some time after that. 2 men connected by an old inheritance, one reopening the matter through legal channels, the other destroying letters that spoke of truth. Miss Marple folded her hands gently. It was becoming increasingly clear that the Hawthorne estate held a secret that neither man had yet fully revealed, and somewhere beneath that quiet secret lay the reason Mr. Adrian Faulkner had arrived in St. Mary Mead carrying so much fear. Chapter 7. There was a certain kind of tension that sometimes settled over a village before an important truth came to light. It was not something easily described, and most people would not have noticed it at all. Yet Miss Marple had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead to recognize the quiet feeling that appeared when events were slowly drawing toward a conclusion. On that particular evening, the air itself seemed unusually still, as though the village were holding its breath. Miss Marple had spent the better part of the afternoon thinking carefully about everything she had learned over the past few days. The arrival of Mr. Adrian Faulkner, clearly nervous and watchful. The appearance of Mr. Leonard Cresswell shortly afterward. The renewed interest in the Hawthorne estate. The midnight visitor beneath Faulkner's window. And the fragment of a letter speaking of an old Hawthorne truth. Each of these details had seemed small when viewed alone, but together they formed a pattern that Miss Marple now believed she understood rather well. She decided that the matter required a quiet gathering of the people most closely connected with it. And so, that evening, a small group assembled in the comfortable sitting room of the Rose and Crown. Mrs. Dalton had arranged the chairs near the fireplace, and the warm light from the lamps created a calm and friendly atmosphere. The gathering itself appeared quite ordinary, though those present sensed that Miss Marple had invited them for a very particular reason. Mr. Adrian Faulkner sat near the window. His expression looked weary, and his hands remained folded tightly in his lap as though he were holding himself steady. Mr. Leonard Cresswell stood near the mantel, calm and composed as ever. Also present were Colonel Harbury and Mr. Harding, the village solicitor, both of whom had agreed to attend after Miss Marple requested their assistance earlier that day. Miss Marple herself sat quietly in her usual chair. For a few moments no one spoke. Then Miss Marple began in her gentle, thoughtful voice. "It is always interesting," she said calmly, "how the past sometimes finds its way back into the present, particularly in villages like ours, where memories tend to remain quite clear even after many years." Mr. Cresswell gave a polite smile. "I imagine that is quite true." Miss Marple nodded. "The Hawthorne estate is a good example." At the mention of the name, Mr. Faulkner shifted slightly in his chair. Miss Marple continued. "Many years ago, the property belonged to Mrs. Margaret Hawthorne, a widow who had lived there peacefully for quite some time." Mr. Harding, the solicitor, nodded. "Yes, that is correct." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "When Mrs. Hawthorne passed away, the estate was transferred to Mr. Adrian Faulkner, who had been named as heir in her will." Mr. Faulkner stared quietly at the floor. Miss Marple turned her eyes toward Mr. Cresswell. However, there had been another possible heir at that time. Mr. Cresswell's expression remained pleasant. "Yes, there was." Miss Marple spoke softly. "Mr. Leonard Cresswell." A faint silence settled over the room. Miss Marple continued calmly. "The matter was settled rather quickly, I understand. Mr. Cresswell withdrew his claim, and the estate passed to Mr. Faulkner." Colonel Harbury nodded. "That is how I remember it." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Yet such matters are rarely resolved quite so easily." Mr. Cresswell's smile grew thinner. "Are you suggesting something improper occurred?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not exactly improper." She paused briefly before continuing. "Merely incomplete." Mr. Faulkner lifted his head slowly. Miss Marple looked toward him kindly. "Mr. Faulkner, you came to St. Mary Mead because you discovered something about that inheritance." Mr. Faulkner's face grew pale. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. "Yes." The word hung heavily in the room. Miss Marple nodded gently. "You learned that Mrs. Hawthorne had been planning to change her will shortly before her death?" Mr. Harding looked surprised. "I was not aware of that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It appears the matter was not widely known." Mr. Faulkner spoke again, his voice tense. "I discovered the information years later while reviewing some old correspondence." Miss Marple continued calmly. "The change would have altered the inheritance significantly." Mr. Faulkner nodded slowly. "Yes." Miss Marple glanced toward Mr. Cresswell. "And that change would have benefited Mr. Cresswell." For the first time, Mr. Cresswell's expression hardened slightly. "That is speculation." Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "Perhaps." She turned back toward Mr. Faulkner. "You realize that the will Mrs. Hawthorne signed may not have been the final one she intended." Mr. Faulkner swallowed. "Yes." Colonel Harbury leaned forward slightly. "Are you suggesting the will was altered?" Miss Marple spoke carefully. "I believe the circumstances surrounding the inheritance were not entirely honest." Mr. Cresswell laughed softly. "A very serious accusation." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Not an accusation, an observation." Mr. Faulkner finally spoke again. "I was afraid to reveal what I discovered." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes." He looked toward Mr. Cresswell. "Because I believed Mr. Cresswell had been watching me ever since." The room grew very quiet. Mr. Cresswell remained standing near the mantel, though his calm expression had begun to fade. Miss Marple continued in her soft voice. "When Mr. Faulkner began investigating the matter more closely, he received a letter warning him about the truth behind the Hawthorne estate." Mr. Faulkner looked surprised. "You found the letter?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only a fragment of it." She paused briefly. "It mentioned the old Hawthorne truth." Mr. Harding turned toward Mr. Faulkner. "You believe someone might try to stop you?" Mr. Faulkner nodded slowly. "Yes." Miss Marple leaned back gently in her chair. "And that is why Mr. Faulkner arrived in St. Mary Mead so suddenly." She glanced toward Mr. Cresswell. "And why Mr. Cresswell followed him here." Mr. Cresswell's voice had grown colder. "You have a vivid imagination, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled kindly. I simply observe people. There was a long silence. Mr. Faulkner looked toward Miss Marple with a mixture of relief and anxiety. You believe the truth can still be proven? Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I believe the truth has already begun to show itself. She looked slowly around the room. Inheritance disputes often reveal more about human nature than legal documents do. Her gaze returned to Mr. Cresswell, and sometimes the person who seems most confident in the present is the one who has the most reason to fear the past. Mr. Cresswell did not reply. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. The pieces of the puzzle had finally begun to fall into place. Yet one final question still remained unanswered, and as Miss Marple looked from one man to the other, she knew that before the night ended, the truth behind the Hawthorne estate would have to reveal itself completely. Chapter 8. It was a curious habit of truth that it rarely arrived with noise or drama. More often, it appeared quietly, settling into a room almost unnoticed, until suddenly everyone present realized that something undeniable had been placed before them. On that evening at the Rose and Crown, as the small gathering remained seated around the warm glow of the fire, Miss Marple had the gentle sense that the long shadow hanging over the Hawthorne estate was finally ready to lift. For several moments after Mr. Faulkner's uneasy admission, the room remained silent. Colonel Harbury leaned forward slightly in his chair. Mr. Harding, the solicitor, adjusted his spectacles with thoughtful concern, and Mrs. Dalton stood quietly near the doorway, unsure whether to remain or slip away. Miss Marple, however, looked perfectly calm. She rested her hands lightly in her lap and regarded the two gentlemen before her with the mild attentiveness that had often encouraged people to speak more freely than they intended. Mr. Adrian Faulkner sat pale and weary by the window, as though the weight of many years had suddenly grown heavier. Across the room, Mr. Leonard Cresswell still stood near the mantel, though his earlier confidence had begun to show faint cracks beneath its polished surface. Miss Marple spoke at last in her gentle, thoughtful tone. It seems to me that the Hawthorne estate has been carrying an unfinished story for quite some time. Mr. Cresswell gave a quiet laugh that sounded carefully controlled. An interesting idea, Miss Marple, though I suspect you may be giving a simple legal matter rather more drama than it deserves. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Oh dear, I should never wish to add drama where none exists. She paused slightly before continuing. But there are certain details which do seem rather difficult to ignore. Mr. Harding leaned forward. What sort of details? Miss Marple glanced toward the solicitor. Small matters of timing, for instance. She turned her eyes gently toward Mr. Faulkner. When Mrs. Margaret Hawthorne passed away, the transfer of her estate was arranged remarkably quickly. Mr. Harding nodded slowly. That is true. The documents were prepared and signed within a very short period. Miss Marple continued calmly, and at the time, Mr. Cresswell withdrew his claim without much difficulty. Mr. Cresswell shrugged lightly. Because the legal evidence favored Mr. Faulkner, Miss Marple inclined her head politely. Yes, that was certainly the official explanation. A quiet pause followed. Then Miss Marple added softly, yet sometimes legal evidence can be influenced. Mr. Cresswell's eyes narrowed slightly. That is a serious suggestion. Miss Marple did not appear troubled. Not serious at all. Simply a reflection on human behavior, she turned slightly toward Colonel Harbury. You see, Colonel, people often behave in ways that reveal far more than they intend, particularly when money and inheritance are involved. The Colonel nodded thoughtfully. That is certainly true. Miss Marple returned her gaze to Mr. Cresswell. It occurred to me that Mr. Faulkner's fear might not come from guilt, as some might suppose. She paused briefly. But from something quite different. Mr. Faulkner looked up slowly. Miss Marple continued. Fear created over many years can become a powerful form of control. Mr. Harding frowned slightly. Control? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Imagine a situation where one person knows a secret that could ruin another. Mr. Faulkner's expression tightened. Miss Marple spoke gently, and imagine that the person holding that secret chooses not to reveal it immediately. Mr. Cresswell's voice grew colder. What exactly are you suggesting? Miss Marple regarded him with quiet patience. I believe that many years ago, during the confusion surrounding Mrs. Hawthorne's final days, certain misunderstandings were deliberately encouraged. Mr. Harding looked puzzled. You believe the will itself was altered? Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No. I believe something far more subtle occurred. She folded her hands calmly. Mrs. Hawthorne intended to revise her will shortly before her death. Mr. Harding's eyes widened slightly. That possibility was mentioned at the time, though no revised document was ever found. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. But the knowledge of her intention could still have been extremely valuable. Mr. Faulkner spoke quietly. That is what I eventually discovered. Miss Marple turned toward him kindly. Yes. She looked around the room again. Mr. Faulkner inherited the estate legally. Yet he later came to suspect that the circumstances surrounding that inheritance had been manipulated in ways he did not fully understand. Mr. Faulkner nodded slowly. I began to realize that someone had taken advantage of the situation. Miss Marple continued, and that someone had been Mr. Leonard Cresswell. The name settled into the room like a quiet stone dropping into still water. Mr. Cresswell's smile had disappeared entirely now. That is a remarkable accusation. Miss Marple's tone remained perfectly calm. Not an accusation. Simply an explanation that fits the facts. She leaned slightly forward. You see, Mr. Cresswell, a person who loses an inheritance might react with anger, but a person who discovers an opportunity might react quite differently. Mr. Harding looked thoughtful. You believe Mr. Cresswell realized he could use the situation to his advantage? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. She turned again toward Mr. Cresswell. You allowed the estate to pass to Mr. Faulkner. But afterward you reminded him, from time to time, that certain questions about the inheritance could be raised. Mr. Faulkner spoke quietly. He said the truth might destroy both of us. Miss Marple nodded gently. And so Mr. Faulkner lived for years under the quiet pressure of that possibility. Mr. Cresswell finally spoke again. Pure speculation. Miss Marple's eyes remained kind but steady. Then why follow him to St. Mary Mead? Mr. Cresswell did not answer. Miss Marple continued calmly. You knew he had begun investigating the past. You knew he had received information suggesting the truth might soon come to light. She paused. And you came here to remind him that fear could still keep him silent. Mr. Faulkner lowered his head. I received a letter warning me not to continue. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. The letter you burned in the fireplace. Mr. Harding looked from one man to the other. This is beginning to make sense. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Human nature often does. Once the pieces are placed in the proper order, Mr. Cresswell's calm mask had finally slipped away. You have no proof. Miss Marple's voice remained warm and steady. Proof is a curious thing. Sometimes it appears when people speak too confidently. She gestured lightly toward Mr. Harding. The solicitor has already begun reviewing the original documents again, and now that the circumstances have been discussed openly, I imagine several additional details will come to light. Mr. Cresswell remained silent. Miss Marple leaned back gently in her chair. For many years, Mr. Faulkner lived in fear that the truth of the Hawthorne inheritance might ruin him. She smiled softly. But in reality, the truth was far more troubling for someone else. Mr. Harding closed his notebook slowly. I believe this matter will require further examination. Mr. Cresswell did not argue. The fire crackled softly as the room fell into a thoughtful silence. Mr. Faulkner looked as though a heavy weight had finally begun to lift from his shoulders. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Well, she said kindly, I believe the evening has grown rather long. Mrs. Dalton gave a small relieved smile. Yes, I think we could all use some rest. The gathering slowly broke apart. Colonel Harbury and Mr. Harding stepped outside to continue their discussion quietly, while Mr. Faulkner remained seated for a moment beside the window. Miss Marple paused near the doorway before leaving the room. The mystery of the Hawthorne estate had rested quietly in the village for many years, hidden beneath polite silence and careful avoidance. But like so many secrets, it had never truly disappeared. It had simply waited. And now, as the peaceful night settled once more over the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt quite certain that the long shadow of fear surrounding Mr. Adrian Faulkner had finally begun to fade. For in the end, it had not been guilt that haunted him. It had been the quiet power of a man who believed fear could hide the truth forever. And Miss Marple knew from long experience that truth, once it began to reveal itself, rarely returned to hiding again. Morning arrived gently over St. Mary Mead the following day, as though the village itself wished to return quietly to its usual peaceful rhythm. The early sunlight drifted across the hedges and fields, and the church bell sounded its familiar hour. To anyone walking along the narrow lanes, nothing appeared unusual. The cottages looked the same, the gardens were neat and calm, and the soft murmur of village life had already begun again. Yet for those who had gathered at the Rose and Crown the previous evening, something important had shifted. Miss Marple sat by the window of the guest house with her morning tea, watching the pale light spread across the road outside. She looked as calm and comfortable as ever, though her eyes held the thoughtful quietness of someone who had finished considering a difficult puzzle. Mrs. Dalton entered the room carrying a tray of fresh toast. "Well, Miss Marple," she said softly, "I must say the house feels much calmer this morning." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Yes, I believe several matters have finally begun to settle." Mrs. Dalton placed the tray down and lowered her voice slightly. "Mr. Harding came by early. He said the situation regarding the Hawthorne estate will be reviewed properly now." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That seems only fair. And Mr. Faulkner?" Miss Marple glanced toward the window. "He left a short while ago. I believe he wished to take a walk before deciding what to do next." Mrs. Dalton sighed with relief. "Poor gentleman. He has looked so terribly anxious these past few days." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "Living with fear for many years can make even the safest places feel uncertain." Outside, the quiet lane remained peaceful. After a moment, the door opened again, and Mr. Adrian Faulkner stepped into the room. But he looked different now. The strain that had weighed on his face when he first arrived had softened noticeably. His posture seemed steadier, and although he still appeared tired, the constant tension in his expression had eased. He approached Miss Marple with a grateful smile. "I wish to thank you before leaving the village." Miss Marple looked up warmly. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Faulkner. I believe you may have given me something I have not felt in many years." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And what is that?" "Peace of mind." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Sometimes the truth is the only thing that can provide it." Mr. Faulkner nodded slowly. "I spent far too long allowing fear to guide my decisions." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "That is something many people do. Though few are willing to admit it," he hesitated before continuing. "I think I shall remain here for a few days longer. I would like to see the Hawthorne estate again before deciding what to do next." Miss Marple gave a soft nod of approval. "That sounds like a very sensible plan." Mr. Faulkner thanked her once more and quietly left the room. Miss Marple remained by the window, watching the peaceful village road as the morning continued to unfold. St. Mary Mead had returned to its usual calm appearance, yet Miss Marple knew that beneath its gentle surface, the village had once again revealed an important truth about human nature. Fear could hide many things, but it could never hide them forever. And as Miss Marple lifted her teacup and looked out across the quiet fields, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile at the comforting knowledge that in St. Mary Mead, the truth always found its way home in the end.